well, welcome to our InfoSeCon session, where we got two great speakers on tonight with over 20 years experience. We have Adrian Amos and David Branscome. Adrian is the Senior Solutions Engineer at Synergy Technical. And he's been there for about 8 years, providing support for all kinds of clients, identifying security weaknesses and vulnerabilities. He leads security workshops that provide a hands-on environment to explore identity management, cloud app security, data classification, labeling, and data loss prevention, among other subjects. Along with this expertise, he's been invited and actually has hosted security workshops at Microsoft Ignite for the last 2 years. And he has hosted over 15 sessions. So I introduce you all, Adrian Amos.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Happy to be here with you guys tonight, and hopefully we'll give you something you can build some excitement about. So I'm excited about it, and actually I'm excited to be co-presenting this evening with David Branscome from Microsoft. David and I have done a few little tag team events over the last couple of years, but this is an exciting area for me, and I hope you'll enjoy it. Anyway. A little teeny bit about us as an organization. We're founded in 2011, headquartered here in Richmond, Virginia, where we just had the tropical storm blow through today. So it's why I'm actually in the office. You can tell the exciting white wall behind me. Wanted to make sure I would have power. So, always a challenge when they blow through. But we've been around since 2011. Like I said, we have offices kind of all up and down the East Coast. We were recently named the Microsoft M365 Security Deployment Partner of the Year. That was kind of cool. Flew out to San Francisco right before the pandemic started and got to bring home a nice big award. So we do lots of fun stuff around productivity and security and managed services. We support over 2 million seats of cloud users. We've worked in over 70 countries, have toured the entire United States of America, including territories and provinces. Kind of been an exciting place to be. So with that, I'm going to jump into talking about why we're here tonight, right? So we want to start our conversation about identity from the perspective of the challenges that we face with it. We're specifically around sprawl, right? So let's talk about what identity is, where it is, what it exposes, and how we can protect those exposures. So to do that, I want to start with our most common instances of identity, right? We have our usual suspects in this list. Corporate credentials, personal stuff on the internet, some government documents, maybe a GPS watch. Right now, each of those represents a completely separate instance of your identity. And each of these separate identities exists to expose or to present certain attributes, claims, or assertions. So like, I am an employee, please let me in. I have opinions on the internet, or I like to swim, bike, run, etc. And some can prove other details about us, like proof of residence or authorization to receive medical care, or about our net worth or debt load, right? And in many cases, we're actually very intentionally exposing these claims and assertions willingly. They're the reason why we choose to participate in this particular identity matrix, right? I, for instance, am an avid cyclist, but my Facebook friends don't care about my functional threshold power or my maximum heart rate. So I track and share that data in a separate stream from that of Twitter or Facebook. But in most cases, we are sharing data much more widely than we really intend. Most free services on the internet are only free because your data is being sold, right? But this also extends to the physical world. Piggly Wiggly isn't interested in just whether or not you come back to their store to buy. They want to understand your buying habits. You may recall a few years ago that Target's analytics caused a big stink when a teenage girl started getting tailored ads for prenatal vitamins. And her father complained to the corporate networks, but her buying patterns matched those identified as having prenatal shopping habits. And he was enraged, naturally, right, that Target would have such gall, but it turned out that their analytics were correct. She was, in fact, pregnant. And surprise, it's a Target birth announcement, right? So Twitter and Facebook track all that information as well, but they also track and prioritize sentiment, which is why you always see things filtering to the top that focus on 3 key emotions, right? Nostalgia, envy, and anger, because they drive additional engagement and get you to reveal more information about yourself. And even financial services will sell our data. That loan that was super duper easy to apply for is going to stuff your inbox for years with partner offerings. And now you've also identified yourself as being a big spender looking to make big life changes. So in all these cases, all these disparate and separate identities come down to one basic thing, right? A credential pair. Now, this is not intended to be a discussion about the importance of multi-factor authentication or even a drive toward passwordless, whatever. I'm assuming that somebody else is already giving you that spiel, not here for it. But in every scenario, we are looking at defining access and identity as some sort of credential that's posted or exposed somewhere, right? And there needs to be protections around that, whatever protections you choose. But the other thing that all of these identities have in common is that you don't own them. You don't own the content that represents you. Once you've put that data out into the world, it's almost impossible to bring it back. And it's much, much more pervasive than that simple list too, right? You have identities you don't even know about, spread far and wide through various permutations that expose all sorts of data about you. So what you have to realize then is that your identity is everything you do. It is everywhere you go, and you own very little, if any, of it. And that extends all the way out to pictures on the internet, right? Remember this guy? This was the guy who told Hawaii a couple of years ago that they were under imminent missile attack. Before that fateful day, this picture had already been out there for 2 or 3 years on the internet. It was just a file photo of him. Nothing really terribly interesting for a lot of people, except what's that hiding down in the bottom corner? Enhance. Yes, that is his password stuck on a monitor, right? So I'm not here to talk to you about MFA, but it is an important part of understanding the challenge of identity management, right? So we have to decide how we're going to choose to protect all of these separate instances of identity out there. And again, not specifically a conversation about MFA, but more about the vast array of separate instances that exist under someone else's control, right? So the Hawaii guy did what corporate users notoriously do, right? He put a sticky note on his monitor. And I guarantee you that just about anybody on this call could go into their corporate office, walk around and pick up enough keyboards and monitors to find enough sticky notes to get through a couple of years worth of authentications. Maybe even at the front edge of a drawer kind of thing, right? Or maybe you run into the problem of there's unequal support for MFA out in your connected services. I happen to be fortunate enough that most of the cloud services I engage with do support MFA, and I'm happy with the way that's working for you, but it's not universal. Maybe you decide to use a password keeper, right? Those are always a great idea, but how do you choose which one is the right one? Why do you trust the one that you do? It's all well and good for them to say your passwords are secure and say 1Password, but how do you know for sure that thing doesn't do a nightly password dump to an Excel file somewhere? You just really don't, right? So what do the users do? They go to credential recycling, or maybe they turn to a consumer SSO. And this is where it gets interesting, right? So consumer SSO kind of represents the first opportunity for people to start minimizing the number of separate identities and allowing some service to manage that on their behalf. The problem that you get into, though, is that, first of all, you still don't own it. It's still somebody else's. And then you still have problems like this. Maybe relying on Facebook for SSO isn't such a great idea. We may recall a couple of years ago, there was a kind of a little problem where they exposed a lot of content to Cambridge Analytica. And, that's not the only time that content has been exposed. But what I find particularly delightfully fascinating is that as I was preparing this content and looking up information about the Facebook breach, here's an NYT article suggesting I conveniently use my Google SSO to log into the New York Times, right? So even here they're telling me not to do it, they're also turning around and telling me to do it. So I guarantee you that the challenge is not just whether or not we choose the right SSO provider, right? One way or the other, you're going to find a name somewhere on this delightful scrolling list that at some point has failed to protect your identity or the identity of your users. And this list is by no means comprehensive. This particular one expires at 2017, and there's been a whole lot of big stuff since then, including specifically like the Starwood Marriott breach. Oh my gosh, that one was amazing, right? And it may well be through all of this that our generation's greatest contribution to our children's future is a lifetime supply of free credit monitoring out of this. So Obviously, there's also been a cottage industry built up to start understanding, what our own threats are out in the world and keep track of whether or not we've been breached. But I can go ahead and save you the time. Your name, your email address, however it is that you've defined your identity out there, has been exposed in some sort of meaningful way. So to detangle the mess of identity, start putting control back into the hands of its rightful owner, which is you, which is me, which is us, right? We need to understand what is the purpose of identity in any given situation, the goal of any given identity related transaction, and how we can leverage technology that exists today to bridge these gaps, because we're 35 years into this thing and we can't just keep waiting for the next big thing to solve it for us. I mean, how many of us have become fully migrated to IPv6, right? We're not there yet. So identity, or perhaps rather identification at its simplest model, is a means of representing yourself in relation to your governing body, whatever that is. I am of this tribe. I am the son of Bob. I live in this or that province. I have paid my taxes. I was born on XYZ date. Identification helps governments establish what it is exactly they're governing and how to service the social contracts that exist between the government and the governed. In its earliest identification schemes on the planet, right, jewelry, fabrics determined identification. Think of kings and queens wearing crowns, or bishops in their mitres and robes. The Maori used tattoos to tell stories of ancestry and personal achievement. Tartans represented clan membership in the British Isles, right? Babylon added census data, which is super crazy cool if you imagine that they did it without a numerical system at their behalf. And that's just mind-boggling, right? Rome added paper records to the mix with the first detailed representations of recorded life events. And things didn't really change on a substantial level until the advent of the photograph and the fingerprint in the 1800s, in the Victorian era, which also ushered in the first numerical systems for records. And even those advances still took another 100 years to fully penetrate global markets. And it wouldn't be till the 70s and 80s that we even started to get into global identification on a digital level. But if we start digging into what's happened with that advent of digitalization, there's starting to become a bigger concern understood and acted upon by governments about how we need to safeguard that data, right? We start to see the first ideas that there is such a thing as privacy, right? Wow, who would have thought that would be such a crazy thing? And ever since we've gotten to the point where digitalization has truly saturated things, the amount of data that we have to protect and the compliance frameworks that we have to work with has begun to really explode. And I mean explode, right? The regulatory and compliant controls that we are at now are reaching to the point where we are seeing more than 200 changes per day. And it really shouldn't come as a huge surprise that there was kind of a single big catalyst moment that drove a lot of this change, right? So we're at a point now where identity is no longer just this simple model, right? We've now reached a point, and this is not a surprise to anybody, right? Well, there are now organizations that are key participants in the idea of identity. And each of these participants has an identity model that comes with different requirements and different expectations. And so we end up with a wallet full of different ID cards, dozens of logons, hundreds or thousands of individual attributes floating around us all the time, exposing the individual and the corporation to breach. And that leaves corporations desperately needing by law to collect certain types of data to fulfill contractual obligations to both the citizen and the government, but also with the paradoxical requirements in many cases that they have and do not have the same piece of data, right? Crazy. So what we need to start thinking of is who owns this data, right? Decentralizing the identity seeks to reduce the exposure of the attributes, of the credentials, of the claims, put those things back into the ownership of the individual themselves, and allow those individuals to expose those attributes, credentials, claims, whatever, in a verifiable, on-demand way, but also revocably, and built on technologies that exist in the wild today, because again, we cannot wait for internet.vnext to solve these problems for us. So the model that we have to follow is actually pretty straightforward. It boils down to some very simple key ingredients, right? And we'll dig into a little bit more, and David will actually show a lot more detail about how these things actually play. So the flow is pretty straightforward, right? An issuer, the organization, digitally signs an attestation, which is credentials, claims, or a set of attributes, whatever, and presents it to the holder as a credential, right? I'm the holder. I went to this university. I am the holder of this diploma. The holder that can then present that credential to a verifier to gain access to a system, prove some sort of a claim of identity, demonstrate knowledge or mastery of a subject, like an SAT score for college admission. And then the verifier then confirms the assertion against a verifiable data registry, like blockchain. So I want to take my SAT score and present it to, College of William and Mary. I'm not calling up SAT and saying, can you send me a paper copy anymore? I'm just holding up a digital code, and William and Mary says, boop, okay, yeah, that was your real score. So you, as the holder and the issuers, certificates and verifiers, this can be anything. This can be anything, right? You as the holder could expose, for instance, a frequent diner card at your local burger joint without exposing any other data, or industry certifications, highest level of completed education, or that you're a registered voter at your correct polling place. In an emergency medical situation, you could present allergy information to EMTs, or insurance information available for hospital intake staff to reduce your time to care. And the system is built, like I said, on some pretty simple ideas, right? It's built on open standards, 100% built on open standards. It allows users or human beings to possess one or more IDs, DIDs. They're not owned by any central distributor, hence decentralized. So they're not just an email address back to the password, right? In fact, they could be any combination of attributes that we want them to be. They have to be resolvable across public ledgers like blockchain, but attributes, claims, credentials, etc., are managed by keys accessible only to the user, with user managed consent to access those claims, including granular access controls. And in practice, you put all these things together, right? You get these key elements, although it's important to call out that some of these elements are still going through iterative design phases, and we'll touch on that a little bit later too. But crucially, and this is where I get so excited about, this is why I'm here tonight, right? I don't have a product to sell you, and I'm so excited about that. There is no actual product that I can wrap up and call, hey, this is decentralized identity. Why don't you buy 10,000 copies of it? Microsoft doesn't have a product around it. What we have is a framework. And within this framework, we actually have Microsoft contributing to the design process and actually offering up key tweaks to the Bitcoin blockchain to allow it to globally scale to the number of identity transactions that would have to be processed for this to work at a global scale, right? This is exciting stuff. So from an organization's perspective, right, the newcomer in the triumvirate of identity management, this means that we no longer have to actually collect, store, or protect identity data. When the user expresses their desire to be forgotten, as guaranteed through GDPR, CCPA, and all that fun stuff, they can service that request themselves by simply revoking access to the data and the credentials that they've exposed to the organization. And that puts the user firmly back in control of not just the types of data that they express, but also how it's accessed and how many different authentications we have to remember to keep control of it. And crucially, also understand that more and more organizations are getting involved in this. There is a Decentralized Identity Foundation that plays a big part in helping onboard all these organizations. But the group of organizations involved in this was generated probably a month ago, and I guarantee it's gotten a heck of a lot longer since then. So it's an exciting time to be on board with this while it's still kind of in the design phase. So I'm going to turn it over to David Branscome from Microsoft to talk about how Microsoft has this flexibility, has demonstrated this flexibility and control in the real world. David?
All right, cool. Let me go ahead and share my desktop. Let's see, there we go. And can you just confirm that you see my desktop, Adrian?
I do.
All right, cool. So what we're going to do here is talk about an example of decentralized identity. And the example that we're going to walk through is a scenario where a student at a university wants to get a discount on some books. And the books are not sold through the university, they're sold through a third party. But we want to figure out how do we, using identity, correctly identify the user, correctly identify the university and the student's affiliation with that university, and get them the discount. So how does this all look in practice, or how does this all work together? So if we assume here that we've got a user or a student at Contoso University, they log into the school portal. when they log into the school portal, we'll say the user here is Alice Smith. If you notice, there is a prompt there to get a new digital student card. And along with that is a QR code that she can scan with her phone, and that will get her this digital student card. Now, what's the value of this? Well, as I said, there's an online bookstore, we call it Fabricam Books. And this is where Alice wants to get her school books. So as I mentioned, Fabricam is not linked to Contoso University at all for the purposes of this discussion. This could be Amazon, right? She could be buying her books from Amazon. It doesn't make any difference. But they have a QR code down at the bottom of their website as well that you see here. They've got a promotion going. And that promotion says, if you scan this QR code to confirm that you're a current student at a school, then we'll give you 20% off of the books. So this is the problem that we're trying to solve. And we want to make sure that everybody retains their identity in the whole scenario. So let's see how this all works together. So Alice signs into the school portal just like she always does, using her username and password. Now, with this scheme, we want everybody, again, to control their own identity, including Contoso University. And so one of the first things that we want to see is how Contoso secures their identity. Now, if you think about it, what does a typical identity system provide? So there's three things, essentially. First of all, it gives you a place to store credentials, which in this diagram is the purple key, the little card under Enterprise Agent. You see the purple key. So that's the key manager. The second thing is it provides a place to write these identities, some sort of directory. And so in our case, we're saying that this can be blockchain, right? It can be some sort of digital ledger system so that the data that's written there is immutable. No one can make changes except the person or organization that has rights to it. And so that's what we're seeing take place here. Contoso has written part of their identity to the blockchain. Now, what's in this? There's a trust document that's published here with, as you see down at the bottom, a service endpoint URL. And that service endpoint URL says, if you need to verify these credentials for Contoso University, call me at this URL and I'll verify this for you. And as you can see, there is nothing in this document that would be classified as confidential information, right? You might say that this is just institutionally identifiable information, and it doesn't look any different from a user standpoint. This is what it looks like specifically for Contoso, but from an end user perspective, their document is very similar. But because this document exists, because this trust document exists, anybody in the world can go to that service endpoint and see that if credentials were signed using the set of keys that are also referenced there, then the person that's gone to the service endpoint can be sure that the credentials belong or originated with Contoso, okay? Now, as a result of this, Contoso can digitally sign requests such as the QR code that we were talking about before, right? So Alice scanned the QR code to get her student ID, and they can also store this in their own directory store, just like you would store credentials with any other identity program. So think about Active Directory. If you have Active Directory, what is that used for? What's the value of it? So we have a location where we maintain a list of the users and groups and the permissions, and you might say consent boundaries that define a user or group's permission or ability to access resources within the environment. Right? So something very similar is happening here. Now, Alice now gets a QR code or has scanned this QR code. This QR code has been digitally signed. And now what it says is this request is for Alice at EDU. And secondly, it says it's been signed by Contoso. I've digitally signed this request. And because it's digitally signed, nobody else can come along and claim ownership of that digitally signed request. It is immutably linked to Contoso. Now, the other side of the equation is Alice's side. So Alice has a fairly similar scheme to what Contoso had to go through. Now, because Alice needs to be able to answer the question, how do I know that the entity that I'm communicating with is actually Contoso? What can I do to verify that, right? So she needs to have a way to link herself to Contoso and verify that who she's actually talking to is Contoso, the university. And so what we need in this case is something like what we have in the internet world, DNS. We need something that will tell us where we can find the information about Contoso or any other um, decentralized type of identifier and confirm that the linkage to Contoso is valid. And so what the decentralized identity community has done, or what they've come up with, is this concept of the universal resolver. The universal resolver supports a variety of different methods for contacting it and communicating with it. So you might think of it as like federation services that can be used to locate different identity providers. So in this case, the depiction shows that it could be communicating with Ethereum. It could use Bitcoin. It could use the ION network. It could even theoretically use a domain-based identity system like Azure Active Directory or even on-premise Active Directory. And there's a standard around how you would write a method so that others can perform a resolution against these providers. Now, in this case, what we have is the ION identifier, which is passed down to the universal resolver, which is then able to resolve the identifier. And so, as you can see, this is really in contrast to what happens with, like as Adrian was saying, with like a typical federated provider like Twitter or Facebook or Google, if you use those as your federated provider. They serve as the intermediary in the relationship between you and another organization. This universal resolver takes care of that, but you are in possession of the universal resolver. So in the case of like Twitter or Facebook, if Twitter or Facebook decided unilaterally that they wanted to disable or even delete your account, they could do that. And there's really very little that you could have to say about it, right? They could delete your credentials as part of their identity scheme or their identity framework. And there's not much you can do about it. You can complain, but that's about all. However, in this case, the identifier exists in the blockchain or some sort of digital ledger that, again, is immutable. It can't be modified. It can't be changed by anybody except the owner of that identifier, which in this case is Alice. So this universal resolver exists locally on Alice's device, might be a phone in this case. So what this does is it makes this identifier addressable globally, right? And so now once Alice knows that she has successfully communicated or verified that the organization that she's communicating with is Contoso University, now she can generate her own set of cryptographic keys. And she can then store that set of keys in the secure enclave of her personal device. So again, the credentials, the set of keys that uniquely associate Alice to Contoso, they're stored on the device. And she can register the public key on the internet in the blockchain. At this point now, Alice is on equal footing with the corporations that exist on the internet. So she has her identity that's been validated. Contoso has their identity that's been validated. And of course, what we're talking about here, these are not necessarily identities, these are identifiers, right? But given the attestations that are attached to the identifiers, you could derive an identity from those identifiers. Sorry, a little bit slow there. Now, with those identifiers, Alice can now provide what we call a pairwise set to Contoso University and be accurately linked to Contoso as Alice. What makes this important is that Alice is generating this identifier herself. It's a unique identifier that she is sharing with Contoso University, and the only one who knows what that identifier is and what she's sharing with Contoso is Alice. She is the only one that's aware of this. Now, at this point, Contoso can do a lookup. They can say, I know you said you're Alice. I have reason to believe that it's that it's really you, because you've already signed into our portal with Alice's user ID and Alice's password, but I need to further confirm this. So I'm going to go out to the blockchain and I'm going to confirm that someone hasn't stolen your username and password and is now trying to pass themselves off as you. I know that the digital identifier on the blockchain can only belong to you. And so if someone is in possession of that, then I can be certain that that person is Alice. And once I'm able to digitally verify your identity on the ION network, I can make the decision to issue you a digital card. And that card will confirm that you are, in fact, a student at Contoso University. And so that's what we see taking place here. We see the issuance of this student card to Alice. Now, what's on this card? So as we see here, what we end up with is an identifier that uniquely identifies Allison and uniquely associates Allison with Contoso. Now, Allison is in, or Alice is in control of that identifier. Now, what's interesting about this is that it's different from the way that we do things now. What happens today is that when you log into a service, you have a unique email address or a unique logon address and password for every digital interaction that you have, whether it's on Instagram or Facebook or TikTok or Pinterest or whatever it might be. We have all these identities, like Adrian was referring to earlier, and we lose control over what information is being kept by the provider. We hand them over to the service provider or the application provider. In this case, however, what happens is we have this unique identifier that's been minted exclusively for Alice to interact with Contoso. And so what we have is in the middle there, we have a purple section of the card, which defines the subject. In this case, this is Alice. And then we have the blue part of the card, the blue key in that card, which is the issuer. This is Contoso. So that combination is unique. There's only one person in the world that realistically can have that set of credentials, and nobody else can claim otherwise. Alice can now store this in her personal digital wallet. And from Alice's perspective, the only thing that's happened is she has scanned the QR code. All this other stuff is happening behind the scenes. She doesn't have to request anything or do anything on her side. This is all happening without her input or her being required to do anything from a technical standpoint. Now, after the system has verified that Alice is who she claims to be, the system then says, I'd like to store this credential, this digital student ID card, in your wallet. Now, Alice says yes, and that stores this, this user ID in a local wallet, which again is under Alice's control because it's on her phone and she's got a PIN or some sort of biometric control that restricts who's allowed to open that wallet. And then in a no trust way, the identity hub that is that exists on her machine, it doesn't just trust any arbitrary service that calls to it and requests permission to store something, right? So we want to store this this card in the identity hub, but the identity hub has to verify who this is. And so what it does is it goes out and verifies, am I allowed to write this card into my identity store. So it goes out through the universal resolver to the blockchain to figure out if the credentials that are on the card match the people that are allowed to write to the identity hub. And they get the response back, and it says, sure, we can go ahead and write to the identity hub. We can store this credential on the identity hub. Now, finally, after all the verification, the identity hub needs to store the card in Alice's digital wallet. And so to accomplish this, it does go out and it verifies, am I allowed to write this card into my identity store? Now, let's see how this has some relevance in the real world. So from a business's perspective, the question is, what good is this? How can I use this? Where can it be used? And the answer is it can be used anywhere. So the card from Contoso University can be presented to anyone who recognizes it as a valid identification. And we could call that the relying organization. So think about your driver's license. You can use your driver's license if you go to a restaurant and you order alcohol. And they'll ask you for your driver's license so that they can validate your age using the driver's license. Now, when the DMV created your driver's license, was their primary intent that you be able to buy alcohol? No, of course not. It was a way to confirm that you have been allowed to drive in the state. But because the restaurant is a relying party, they trust the identification that comes from the DMV, and you can use that driver's license to confirm your age, right? Now, similarly, Fabricam is an online bookstore, and even though they have no previous relationship with Contoso University, they can rely on Contoso University to get information about Alice. So they can view a student card from Contoso as being valid proof that a person who claims to be a student is actually a student, and that can be used as the basis for issuing a discount when the student scans the QR code on the website. Now, Alice scans the QR code on the website with her phone, and she gets a permission request to share the information in that card with the Fabricam bookstore. And then most importantly, she gets the notification that you see highlighted there. This is linked to the card. It says that she has shared the information in that student ID card with Fabricam Books. This is important because Alice, as you can see here, still retains control of that set of identifiers. If she wants to revoke those permissions from Fabricam, she has that ability. Whereas if you want to revoke permissions to your personal data from Facebook or Twitter or whatever, it's a much more challenging task. You can never tell if it's actually been accomplished entirely. But she can revoke those permissions directly from her phone if that's the path that she chooses. So in this case, the decentralized identity has accomplished three things for us. And this is kind of just a repeat of what Adrian had talked about before. The first thing is it allows us to verify issuance and status independently. So Fabricam can go to Contoso and verify that, yes, you're the ones that issued this identity to Alice. And I also need you to confirm her status, that she is actually still a student at the university. So in many cases, a student over time transitions from being a student to being a member of the alumni, right? But let's say Alice transitions to being an alumni and she wants to go back to the bookstore and get discounts on additional books. Well, Contoso, that is the owner of the status of Alice, they have the ability to change her status from student to alumni. And then Fabricam, by checking that student ID that is issued by Contoso and verified by Contoso, is able to see the change in her status and say, no, you're not entitled to a student discount because you're now an alumni. You have to pay full price. The second things that this provides is what we call presentation. So currently, if you have an identity provider, whoever that identity provider is, they can say, yes, of course you logged in. We have the logs that prove it. Yes, of course you signed this. We have the logs to prove it. And there's not much you can do about that. But that doesn't necessarily prove anything really, because someone could have stolen your credentials and logged in as you, and the logs would show that Alice is the one that logged in, even though she's not the one that used those credentials. With this decentralized verification process, you're able to confirm the presentation of the credentials because that set of digital credentials exist in a wallet that is under the control of Alice alone. Even if someone was able to capture her login name and her password, they still are unable to duplicate that student card that's been issued by Contoso. It's globally unique. It can't be duplicated by an attacker. The last thing that this does for us is entitlement. So this is between the subject, which as we said is Alice, and the issuer, which is Contoso, just between those two. In other words, there's no intermediary, there's no Facebook, there's no Google in the middle that mediates the relationship between these two entities, or that can come in and have a say in how that student card is being issued between Contoso and Alice. That unique relationship is controlled by those two entities, and there's no one that exists in the middle, such as a third-party identity provider. So that's how this would work in practice. There's a number of scenarios where it could be used outside of this one. Think about, for example, somebody who has lost everything due to a natural disaster. What if there was a way to issue a set of credentials to them that allows them to begin digitally rebuilding their lives, establishing a bank account, getting a driver's license, signing up for public assistance, buying property, and so on? You could have a set of credentials under the control of the individual themselves and have portions of their identity shared with the DMV, with a bank, with a social worker, and so on. So even though their own records may have been destroyed in a hurricane or whatever, as long as the wallet has been backed up somewhere, they can retrieve those credentials and begin rebuilding their life. So there's still a number of issues that need to be ironed out with decentralized identity, but this is the direction that identity really has to go if users are going to have control over their own digital identity. So that's how it works. I'm going to turn it back over now to Adrian.
All right. Thank you, David. Really, really appreciate you doing the heavy lifting for me there. I'm not kidding, actually. I really do. I think it's great. And I'm excited because there have actually been real world scenarios that have been used to demonstrate these capabilities. And, you know, there's, if anybody wants to go and watch some great content from Ignite last month, there's actually one that's in conjunction with the Navy with Mill Gears and their veterans looking to get enroll in higher education. So there's a lot of really cool stuff that's coming. But one thing I wanted to touch on here as we kind of wind down here is that most of what we've explored so far really pertains to customer identity scenarios, right? If you look at the Contoso bookstore, right, that's a customer scenario. Even proving all the stuff that we've talked about so far is really principally proving to outside industries and organizations what we're trying to do. But I actually think there's some really exciting opportunities to sort of blend the enterprise identity management and the customer identity management using this same technology. So if we shift gears for a hot second, enterprise identity is actually pretty simple, right? The IT guys are responsible for knowing about the user. You have a hierarchy with objects to which you attach attributes, ACLs, apps, all that fun stuff, right? You ask the user, the holder of that identity, to safeguard it with password hygiene. You issue the device, control the operating environment, the apps, all that fun stuff. Generally, the identity has been restricted to corporate assets within your enclave. And I appreciate you, David, using that same word. I love that word. It's one of my absolute favorites of all time. And it may get extended to other things through SSO, right? This is the account object to which we've paid all the attention for the last 30-some years of corporate IT. Without a secure enterprise identity as a foundation, your organization is susceptible to all manner of attacks against reputation, data, all that fun stuff. So because of that philosophy, though, it's very rare to see organizations let individuals control much about their own actual identity objects. Maybe they can reset their own passwords, right? But that's usually about the sum of it. Think about it in your organization. How long does it take an average user to change their last name after getting married? I have seen it take long enough, and this is straight up legitimately true. I mean, I did in-house corporate IT for 15 years before jumping into the cloud. I have seen it take long enough for that same user to cancel the request because they got divorced. So because of how differently we manage these identity models and how differently they're architected, and because of licensing complications, we in IT have generally tended to view enterprise and customer identity philosophies as being completely, totally independent, separate from each other, right? No middle ground, except there is now a middle ground. We're seeing organizations collaborating in ways that aren't strictly federated. They're not strictly customer based. They're business to business, right? So if we think about it in the Microsoft lingo, these are the B2B connections, right? So if we're looking at the picture on the left, the enterprise identity, that's AD or Azure Active Directory. If you're looking at the one on the right, that's Azure AD B2C, business to customer. But there's a big middle ground in between. And I mentioned this lingo specifically because I just saw earlier this week that Microsoft is entering into public preview phase of allowing conditional access controls on B2C. So I'm really excited about that. But anyway, while Microsoft and a lot of what we've been talking about has been largely focusing on the paradigm of consumer identity, we have this ability to sort of align all three models, right? Why, for instance, do you want to create a separate new account for me, a new user, when I already have this tremendous digital footprint in the outside world? What if we stopped viewing identity as an IT problem and viewed it more the way that HR views employees? Oops, pardon me. So you can be a W-2 employee, or you can be a 1099 contractor. And most corporations in the world today are well accustomed to dealing with both. The 1099 worker is responsible for paying their own taxes. So the corporation can pay a flat rate and be done. No complexities of benefits, easier severability, greater flexibility for the employee to use their own equipment and just focus on getting the job done. That same model can actually exist for identity if we let it. And I'm gonna tell you what, right now, the parallels here are actually pretty crazy because, as we're all working from home, we've got more and more people who are actually using their own personal devices to access work, just exactly the same way that 1099 worker might, as opposed to a W-2. So we're actually kind of well positioned for this. And the crazy thing is that Azure Active Directory already has the tooling in place to accommodate this future. So if I look at my Azure Active Directory and my little demo, tiny tenant for Contoso, I have my list of users, right? And I can see that I have a whole bunch of Contoso employees here and a guest account that is actually my real life Synergy technical account. That account was not created in this environment at all. It's a local representation of my external identity. And if I want to invite another guest, I can bring them in as an admin if I want to. And this is all the information I need to provide. Azure AD will send that person in that identity space an email telling them that they've been invited to come and participate in this environment, right? Note that there's no password to fill in, right? The user is going to be bringing their actual identity experience to this scenario. So we're just inviting these people in to come and play with whatever it is we want to do. We can block them from signing in. We can now do conditional access against how they get into our stuff. We can give this job information. We can join it to groups, and we can even assign this external identity to privileged roles inside of our organization. And that's all well and good as it allows non-Microsoft identities to interact with Azure Active Directory environments. But last year, Microsoft also unveiled a whole new set of identity governance capabilities around entitlement management that felt to me like they were custom tailored to address decentralized identities. And yes, in fact, a little bit, they kind of were. So you already saw that my actual real Synergy technical account is allowed to play in Contoso, and I have added my account to some elevated roles in Contoso and protected those elevations with just-in-time access. But I can also take that kind of integration much further with the entitlement management capabilities. So in Contoso, I've actually started to capture some of the more common job types within the organization and convert them to what are now called access packages. So for my AD guys in the group here, this is taking your security group best practices and defining job roles that are domain global groups and adding your domain local groups for access to the resource into the domain global groups and only adding users to domain, same kind of basic thing. We're building our packages, right? And I'm able now to expose these packages internally and or externally based on how I want to do my role holders. So Contoso has decided they don't want to hire internal salespeople anymore. They're going to go 1099 with sales contractors for the rest of forever. And as the IT guy, I've taken all the steps necessary to build the access package for the sales job and expose it to external role holders. The package defines not just the actual resources, but the level of access into each one of these resources that the person should have, whether or not it's going to be exposed to internal and or external identities, build up the entire access review packet methodology too. So there's this whole approval and review process. If it comes in, the first stage is that it's going to go to Megan Bowen to approve it. And if she doesn't do something within 5 days, it's going to go to her boss. Once she rubber stamps the approval, it's going to go over to Diego to approve in HR. And if he doesn't do anything, it's going to bump up the chain to Nestor. Then after we do grant this external person access into our internal resources, we're going to review it quarterly. And they're going to have 25 days to complete these reviews, or the access is simply going to drop. And this is going to go on forever and ever, amen, as long as we continue to give this person access into our environment. The external user's experience then is they're going to get a link to that email that they use to register their access into our environment to see their access packages, right? And they're going to be able to see all the things that if they light this package up, they'll be able to use. So they're going to get a nice big plus easy button that they click on, and it's going to come up with a list of questions for them to go through the onboarding process, right? In this particular scenario, I've got the 3 questions to get to the Holy Grail. But because I can, and it's all time bound too. So, you know, if I want to ask for it only for 30 days, I'm just a seasonal employee, maybe, you know? So because I can expose all of this to an external identity, it makes me wonder why, once all the details of DID are fully worked out, hang on to that statement for a second, why would I want to be in the business of managing identity at all, right? That's a huge risk for me as an IT guy. That's something I got to stay up late in the night and worry about. So again, I want to come back to the idea that Microsoft doesn't have a product for you to buy today. There is no decentralized identity version 3.0 that you can go and buy from Microsoft or really anybody. What they do have is framework and published information on Microsoft's own developer site about how you can actually get into creating and servicing credentials right now. So yes, there are products that you would need to own in order to issue verifiable credentials, but there is no product right now called Microsoft's decentralized identity. And in fact, there is actually a private preview program right now, but all you have to do is sign up and request access. So it's not even a closed private preview. So the technology exists today, but it still has some challenges, right? David mentioned that we're still in a process, still in a phase of defining how some of these things are intended to work together. So it's a young technology. There is a W3 standard, but it really is only a model, right? It doesn't actually define the format of the files necessarily. Interoperability is still dependent on more and more organizations getting on board with the idea. There are some incredibly complex scenarios for authentication and verification that need to be addressed before this will truly work. I did mention that B2C support for conditional access is in public preview right now. So that's actually a huge step towards solving this one. Rich schemas for credentials, they still need to be built out a little bit, right? And the threat model, that's kind of the one that I'm seeing some exciting development around that space, but I'm really excited to see where all this is going. Anyway, and yes, there are different approaches to privacy, because one of the cool things that I mentioned earlier was, what if your EMT and your hospital admission staff could already know your insurance information and allergies, but somehow there has to be a way to expose that without having to open your phone and hold up a QR code, right? And that actually is being addressed. There are concerns about what is the different level of exposure that needs to be made available. Should there be overrides in place for certain things, right? All of this is in discussion right now. And my excitement around the idea of using DID for actual authentication, as you can see up in the top right, that's still in the design and prototype phase, but it's coming. All of these things are coming, right? Many of these things can be a single object that's actually housed on a mobile device. Many of these things require a little bit more development, but the technology is coming together from a lot of different players, and it's building a really rich framework that's going to allow us to be back in control of presenting our identity when we want to, revocably, even offering up the ability to use it as an authentication framework, such that I would take much greater care of this than I ever would with, say, my old 20-plus-year-old Yahoo account. Anyway, if you want to learn more, I don't know how widespread or how quickly you can grab a screenshot of this, but there's so much more information. These are sort of the foundational links that I used to start putting together this content several months ago. But I want to thank you guys so much
Hey,
for your
Adrian,
time tonight. Yes.
you're not sharing.
I'm not sharing anything? Oh,
Yeah, so
no.
just in case they want to get the screenshot.
Oh, hold on. Let me go back then. Yeah, that's awful. I was sharing, wasn't I? Was I?
No.
Oh, no. Boo. Well, hang on. I'm not so good with the Zooms, you know. I'm a Microsoft guy at heart. Oh, no. I can't even find the thing now to go back and do the share. It's like I lost a window. No
Are
fun.
you in full screen view?
I'm not in full screen view. That's the crazy thing.
Okay, let me go ahead and share my screen.
Oh, wait. I think
We
oh,
got
hold on. Yeah, no, I just have this teeny tiny little control bar and I am not. Oh, there we go.
Right
Yikes.
now. Okay.
Man, I thought I had it shared for a while there. Oh, I see. Okay. Man, well, that was just an exciting ramble about my theories. Uh, so yeah, so great additional resources to go out and look through. I'll go back for a hot second here and just show that from building the external integrations into Azure Active Directory, my sales contractor role, approval process for all this stuff, what the user actually sees when they want to go back and light things up. The fact that there is Microsoft published information about how to issue credentials, what you'll need to get started to do that. And then, again, I'm mentioning that some of these things are still a little bit rough around the edges. And then if you want to grab a screenshot, I am sharing now. My humblest apologies. Again, not a Zoom aficionado. All right. And I'll leave it here so you guys can always grab this while we're finishing up. Let me get back into the actual thingamadoodle here. Again, not good at this.
You're looking good. We got about 4 minutes left, and we had a
Okay.
few questions.
So I see a couple of questions that I wanted to kind of go through here real quick, if we have a minute. All right, let me open that up a little bit. Let's see, doesn't this assume the cloud provider of IAM is trusted? How do we trust these providers? So everything is reliant on publicly searchable cryptography. So certificate authorities have to be publicly trusted. Everything has to be out in the public chain. That's kind of generally the first thought. And again, the way that the technologies are working today don't yet support authentication at a global scale. You got to, as David mentioned, they're principally supporting identifiers, right? So we're looking at aggregating attributes about things, claims and credentials, not so much the actual identity yet, but it's coming. Let me see, revoking the identity, can Fabricam still hold the record of who Alice was to associate with that purchase? And that actually kind of ties in the same way right now, right? As you saw in the Contoso University, Alice still had to log into her Contoso University account. So there is still, the way it's built right now, we're exposing the attributes, they're holding an identity. And the way the GDPR and the other laws and regulations are working right now is generally you are in control of what you expose to them, but they can control what they correlate out of it. So if you tell a shoe company that you wear a size 9 quadruple E and you just want to sever that relationship, they have to throw that away. But if you were a terrible customer, they're allowed to keep that, yikes, you were a terrible customer. So they can still hold some pieces of information based on the legal frameworks that are in there. As for why not trust the government to do our identity, that is a very, very, very deep and long-winded conversation. But I will tell you, I had an uncle who didn't legally exist until he tried to buy a car. He was born at home. He was kept in a drawer, and he never went to the hospital until he was like 15 years old. And even then, his parents paid with cash. He didn't exist. I mean, there was no record of him. And him trying to create an identity, like David said, coming back from like fire damage or whatever, was very, very challenging. And in fact, if I recall correctly, he wasn't able to establish an identity without establishing credit, which is a really interesting paradox. So The government itself should not also necessarily be responsible for issuing all of our identity, because they are also not legally allowed to expose certain attribute pairs on our behalf. So that's a choice that you, the user or the identity holder, need to be able to exercise independently. Not to mention that there are governments that exist in conflict with each other, right? And that's just something we're never going to quite get around. That brings us to our last minute. I really want to thank everybody so much for joining us today. I am terribly sorry that my screen share was borked for a little bit there. I'm happy to have you guys reach out. Any questions that you might want to follow up with. Love to hear from you. Thank you so much for your evening.
Okay, well, we'd like to thank Adrian and David for their contributions to this on decentralized identity in the future. We'll be closing at this session.